Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we will be talking about sustainable supply chains. Supply chains are responsible for most of the emissions in any business operations. Supply chain decarbonization will therefore be a critical element of corporate climate action. As 90% of world's businesses are small and medium scale enterprises, working with supply chain, particularly from a scope 3 emissions perspective, and connecting them with the appropriate tools is a vital part of the implementation of an ambitious corporate climate action plan. Today, we will briefly touch upon the elements of sustainable supply chains and how companies can kickstart their journey to decarbonize their respective supply chain. What do we mean by sustainable supply chains? In recent years, supply chain sustainability has emerged as a key corporate goal. Companies have started to measure the environmental and societal impact of their goods and services from the beginning to the end of their life cycles. Supply chain sustainability, therefore, refers to a company's efforts to consider the environmental and human impact of the product and the services journey through the supply chain, from raw material sourcing to its production and manufacturing, packaging, storage, delivery, and every transportation link in between the production and the end consumption stage. The goal of a sustainable supply chain is to minimize the environmental harm from factors like energy usage, water consumption, waste production, whilst at the same time having a positive impact on the people and communities in and around the business operations. These concerns are in addition to the traditional supply chain concerns around revenue and profit. These extend beyond the environmental aspects of resource consumption and carbon footprint to also consider social impact like human rights, child labor, and ensuring health and safety, and a positive work environment for the employees to work in. So, what are the steps that companies can undertake to develop a more sustainable supply chain? According to the Forrester research, focus on these key four areas is integral to developing a more sustainable supply chain. The first area is the procurement or sourcing. Most companies start sustainability sourcing programs by looking at the key raw materials and the resources that they consume from an energy as well as a manufacturing perspective. This includes looking at the energy suppliers, procurement of water, procurement of raw materials, and any other ancillary resources that they may use in producing the products and the services they offer to their customers. The second aspect is looking at the overall and the wider operations of a business. This includes looking at the processes or steps involved across the supply chain that could be made more efficient and eventually could lead to a reduction in resource usage. This includes looking at activities like packaging, logistics, waste disposal, and the likes. The third aspect is looking at the end of life treatment of the products that a company will produce. This particularly looks at avoiding excess waste or obsolete items by designing products for further upcycling and reuse. This also includes looking at producing alternative products and services using the byproducts of the traditional manufacturing and business processes. And the last aspect to a more sustainable supply chain is data and communication. This is important and spreads across all the above 3 points that we have discussed. Measuring the effectiveness of the initiatives undertaken as part of the procurement, operational, or end of life treatment functions, and strengthening any related and ancillary efforts by collecting the right data around the activities and processes and communicating the outcomes to the customers, the supply chain partners, and all other stakeholders across the value chains of a business will be critical for building and strengthening a more sustainable supply chain. As part of our current discussion, we will now look at what exactly will organizations have to do to decarbonize their supply chain. The focus of the next slides will only be on the decarbonization aspect of the supply chain. Other wider elements like human rights, child labor, health and safety, and other environmental factors will be picked up separately. Let us now look at decarbonizing the supply chains. As we've seen, supply chains are responsible for most of the emissions in the business operations. A BCG report also suggests that just 8 industry sectors are responsible for more than 50% of the global greenhouse emissions across the world. And therefore, decarbonizing supply chains, and in particular for the 8 critical sectors that contribute to the most greenhouse gas emissions, is extremely critical. According to the same World Economic Forum and the BCG analysis and report, the 4 steps involved in decarbonizing a supply chain include creating transparency. This involves building value chain emissions baseline and exchanging data with the suppliers in order to set ambitious carbon reduction targets across all the scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and eventually looking at publicly reporting progress on the reductions achieved on the carbon footprint side of things. The second step is optimizing the carbon footprint. Here, redesigning products for sustainability and designing a robust value chain and a sourcing strategy for sustainability play a very important role. The third step, and an equally important element, is engagement with suppliers. This involves integrating various carbon emissions matrix into the procurement process and the standards discussed as part of the procurement function. Subsequently, tracking the performance and working collaboratively with the suppliers to address their emissions will be just as important. And lastly, to decarbonize a supply chain, there is a need to push the traditional ecosystems towards the more sustainability focused agendas and goals. This includes, from an organization's perspective, engaging in various sector initiatives for best practice, certification, advocacy, policy, and the likes, and working with other organizations and participants across the value chain and industry sectors to scale up demand side commitments to give a boost and impetus to products which have been produced and manufactured using more sustainable means and processes and with a reduced carbon footprint. We will now look at each of these 4 steps in more detail. The first step, as we've discussed, to decarbonizing a supply chain is to create transparency. This starts with establishing a comprehensive emissions baseline. which is a crucial step to the entire journey. Supply chain emissions can be calculated with different levels of granularity at a product or a process level, depending on what is more realistic and practical from an organization's perspective. More granular data should and could be used for tier 1 suppliers and for products, components, and commodities that contribute to the most emissions for a business operation. And lastly, once they have transparency on the supply chain emissions, organizations and companies should set a publicly disclosed Paris Agreement aligned target and or a net zero target across all the emission scope, covering critical and key activities across the supply chain, and understanding what such targets and goals could mean for their business and operations going forward. The second element is looking at optimizing the overall carbon footprint of the supply chain. This involves critically looking at redesigning products as an important starting point to reducing the carbon footprint. Design choices can help bring down supply chain emissions right from the initial raw material procurement stage to subsequently the end of life disposal of the product. Companies can fundamentally design products for sustainability by using greener materials, cutting down waste, reducing product variance, increasing recyclability of the end product and the raw materials used as part of the process, improving the repairability of the products, and switching the manufacturing processes and activities to more energy efficient measures, eventually leading to a reduction in carbon footprint. This design changes can subsequently be compounded or collaborated by developing a sustainable sourcing and a procurement strategy to create a more robust and a more sustainable supplier base for the organization. The third step to decarbonizing a supply chain involves engagement with the suppliers. Engagement with suppliers is extremely critical, as without their participation, some of the process and activities that we have seen in the earlier steps might fail. There are two elements to the engagement with suppliers. The first one is setting procurement standards for the suppliers as one of the more powerful direct levers to address the upstream emissions. This includes working with suppliers by setting some specific targets that suppliers need to achieve over a specified period of time. This could be the percentage of renewable energy that they start using in their own business processes, looking at a specific reduction in the waste that they generate out of the process, a reduction in the amount of water or other resources that they might consume as part of producing the products that your organization eventually uses. The second aspect is that in many cases, reducing upstream emissions will require working directly and collaboratively with suppliers on joint abatement and circularity projects. This could mean sharing best practices that an organization has learned of or has developed internally as part of a sector initiative or as part of the R&D exercise that they would have taken internally. If you recollect, we discussed such collaboration with suppliers earlier with the example of AB InBev, which looked at an in-house accelerator and partnered with its vendor and wider supplier base to look at changing the processes for the key raw materials that they use as part of the beer manufacturing process and were forecasting cost savings of approximately 80 million over a 5-year period. The last step to decarbonizing supply chain involves pushing the ecosystems and the communities within which an organization operates to give a boost and impetus to adopting more sustainable business practices. This could mean for organizations to get involved in sector initiatives to increase the overall impact, not just for their own organization, but for the sector in general, at a country or at a global level. Leading companies can also join forces in cross-sector policy groups to change the wider context for decarbonization across not just their own or their sector's value chain, but value chains of all industry sectors globally. Lastly, demand-side commitments can also be a tool to encourage investments in decarbonization technologies. Companies can therefore give a boost to such R&D initiatives as well as activities to identify new technologies and new processes that can be implemented, which will help in reducing the overall carbon footprint of a supply chain. We have now discussed the steps involved in decarbonizing a supply chain. Obviously, any change involves challenges, and there might be barriers to implementing some of the initiatives and the strategies that organizations would have set to make their supply chains more sustainable. We now look at some of the barriers to reducing the carbon footprint of the supply chain, particularly from an upstream emissions perspective. Upstream emissions result during the production of goods or services that business purchases or uses. Reducing emissions in a supply chain can be a tedious task, as organizations might face various obstructions or barriers. As compiled by the World Economic Forum, the barriers here listed are some of the key challenges to reduction of the carbon footprint from upstream emissions. The key one is challenges in execution, which involves a potential knowledge gap among suppliers, higher initial costs of changing the way the business has operated traditionally for however long period of time, performance and cost concerns in low carbon designs, and procurement initiatives which might not be aligned to climate. And lastly, hard to change series productions and processes that would have taken maybe decades to establish is also one of the key challenges in executing a change to decarbonizing a supply chain. The second type of barrier is limited support. This could mean lack of government incentives, actions, or policies available to make the required change within the organization. Concern over customers' willingness to pay, because changing supply chain processes may involve investments, and from a recovery perspective, companies need to consider the return on investments that you might have to undertake to make your supply chains more sustainable. Lastly, some of the costs involved may be too high for an organization to incur on its own on a standalone basis from an individual supply chain perspective. The third barrier is the lack of transparency. This includes lack of data collection or having the right kind of data, high quality data, which could be shared with suppliers as a starting point. The second transparency aspect is lack of clarity on scope 3 boundaries, which activities to consider, which activities to include as part of the scope 3 analysis is a never-ending debate that we will come across well into the future. And lastly, assessing the, the type of scope 3 emissions which could be used for the purposes of making the change and implementing the strategies to decarbonize supply chains. Whether it's on an estimated basis, whether it is on an average basis, there's pros and cons of each of these approaches, and companies will have to consider and work with what is available from a practical as well as a best practice perspective.